the spark and the animal. How Europe forgot its miracle, how Islam lost its nerve, and how power devours what it fears. By Elias Winter. March 9th, 2026. Read by an automated voice. Every empire has a story about why it deserves to rule. Rome said it was order. Britain said it was civilization. America says it is freedom. And yet, under the slogans, a quieter question gnaws at the foundations. At what exact moment did we stop being just another hungry tribe and become something else? Not better people, not chosen people, but different in kind, capable of telescopes and vaccines and nuclear reactors, of global empires and global markets, of planetary-scale machinery whose consequences even its makers cannot fully predict. We call that difference modernity, so we don't have to explain it. We call it Western values, so we don't have to earn it. We fold it into race, or religion, or destiny, because we are too tired and too distracted to sit with the harder truth. There was a spark, a specific, fragile, institutional miracle that happened in Europe. It could have happened elsewhere first. In some sense, it did. And now, the very civilization that rode that spark to planetary dominance is busy sawing through the branch it stands on, insisting its sickness is a sign of moral revival. Meanwhile, the civilizations that once carried the earlier light, the Islamic world that preserved and extended Greek science, that built observatories and hospitals when Europe was still largely illiterate, have their own betrayal to answer for, aborting their climb toward that same spark and retreating into dogma and tribalism, often with Western fingers quietly shaping the knife. This is a story about those two sins, the ingratitude of the West and the abandoned nerve of the Middle East. But before talking about sin, we need to remember the miracle. Part 1. The Spark. 1. The night the sky changed. Imagine a winter rooftop in an Italian city at the turn of the 17th century. The air is damp, the kind of cold that doesn't dramatize itself with snow, just seeps into the stones and the joints and the wood. Below, the city is still mostly medieval. Crooked lanes, low houses pressed together for warmth, church bells that announce the hours of a God who, officially, has already explained the structure of the universe. On the roof, a man stands beside a crude assembly of wood and glass. The instrument is ugly, a long, imperfect tube, more plumbing than divinity. The lenses inside it are cheap and ground by hand. He has had to build and rebuild the thing, because nothing like this really exists yet for what he wants to do with it. Glass was made for windows, for light, not for asking heaven to confess its lies. He raises the tube toward the sky, toward a point of light that the educated world has been told is a perfect, God-like sphere moving in eternal circles. Through the glass, the point becomes a disk, and around that disk, tiny stars. He comes back the next night. The stars have moved. Night after night, he climbs the roof, and the stars swing around the disk like attendants around a throne. They are not painted to the crystal sphere. They orbit a body that itself is said to orbit us. In that small, absurd instrument, the official universe breaks. It breaks not because this one man is morally better, or racially better, or beloved by God. It breaks because, for the first time in a long time, a civilization has been quietly constructing something far more dangerous than an empire. Institutions that protect the question, even when the answer cuts the throat of authority. Behind that man on the rooftop, barely conscious of itself, stands a new ecology. Universities that can hire, fire, and argue without checking every line with a bishop or a prince. Printing presses that can replicate banned ideas faster than censors can burn them. Scientific societies that prize observation over scripture, experiment over status. Rival states that hate each other too much to agree on which heretic to kill. The telescope is not the miracle. The miracle is that he is allowed to keep looking. He will still be threatened. He will still be forced to recant, formally. But the damage is done. The moons of Jupiter exist now in more than one mind. They have been printed. They have circulations and defenders and apprentices. The sky is no longer a closed text. It is a nervous system of matter that can be probed, measured, contradicted. That night is not a lone genius birthing modernity out of nothing. It is a relay. Because centuries earlier, in another language and another faith, somewhere between the Tigris and the Guadalquivir, other men had already begun this work. The telescope is pointed at Jupiter, but the light passing through it still remembers Baghdad. 2. Baghdad, Cordoba, and the first light. Long before that Italian rooftop, there was another city of books. Baghdad under the Abbasids is not a moral paradise. No human city ever is. But it is a machine for thinking. The House of Wisdom gathers Greek, Persian, and Indian texts. Scholars translate, argue, extend. A Persian mathematician writes about algorithms and algebra. A physician compiles medical encyclopedias that Europe will use for centuries. An optical theorist insists on experiment, darkrooms, and lenses, centuries before anyone utters the name Galileo. In Cordoba, street lamps burn when much of Europe is still dark after sunset. In Cairo, hospitals run with a regularity that would shame later kingdoms. The Islamic world, for a long time, is the civilization with the spark. Not the modern spark, printing press, autonomous universities, scientific societies, but an earlier one. The conviction that God's world is intelligible, that numbers mean something, that bodies can be studied and healed, that logic matters. Europe, at this point, is the pupil, not the teacher. Its monasteries copy texts. Its scholars make pilgrimages to learn from Arabic commentaries on Aristotle. The light passes through languages: Sanskrit, Greek, Arabic, Latin. No one owns it. It cares nothing for flags. If there is a chosen people, it is not a nation or a race. It is the loose network of those willing to take reality more seriously than their pride. The house of wisdom falls. The books scatter. But the habit, the idea that knowledge can be cumulative, migrates. By the time the man is on the roof with his telescope, the river of influence has changed direction. The pupil is about to become something even more dangerous than a good student. It is about to turn curiosity into infrastructure. 3. How Europe built an engine out of doubt. The real miracle of Europe is not a single discovery. It is the decision, never fully conscious, always contested, to build machines that outlive their founders and are loyal not to the ruler, but to the question. The medieval university begins as a church project but becomes something else. In Paris, Bologna, Oxford, you get guilds of scholars who argue over Aristotle and law and theology, but also over medicine and astronomy. They develop procedures. Who gets to claim a truth? How claims are defended? Who is allowed to teach? Over centuries, this hardens into the idea that truth is not a royal or priestly prerogative. It belongs to those who can show their work and survive hostile questioning. Then comes the printing press, that rude little device which does for ideas what gunpowder does for walls. Suddenly, Scripture itself can be questioned in the vernacular. Pamphlets fly across borders faster than armies. A monk with a hammer and some theses can fracture a continent. The Reformation and the religious wars nearly tear Europe apart. In the long, bloody hangover, states discover a bitter lesson. If every doctrinal disagreement turns into war, there will soon be nothing left to govern. So they begin to separate the machinery of the state from the total authority of the Church. Not because they became kinder, but because they became tired. Out of fatigue and horror, secularization emerges. A gradual, uneven, improvised attempt to keep the peace by letting multiple beliefs exist under one legal roof. Meanwhile, the scientific societies appear. The Royal Society in England, the Académie des Sciences in France. They formalize a new code, show the experiment, publish the method. Except that your favorite theory can be overturned by a better one. Christianity does not vanish. It is pushed into sharing the public square with a new god, evidence. The important thing is not that Europeans suddenly stop believing. It's that they start building institutions where belief is not enough. This is the spark. A civilization that takes its animal hunger for power and, for a while, leashes it to a pact. We will check what is true, even if it humiliates us. Then, inevitably, it points this new lens at everything else in reach. And power, newly armed with science, wakes up. Part 2. The Animal Logic of Power. 4. From Spark to Empire, the Cow and the Conquistador. Power does not care where its tools come from. It only cares that they work. Once Europe has gunpowder, ocean-worthy ships, compasses, and printing presses, the world shrinks. The Atlantic becomes a corridor, not a wall. Caravels leave Portuguese ports and map coastlines no European council has ever seen. Spanish fleets cross to the Americas. Steel meets obsidian. Smallpox meets immunologically naive bodies. Here, the animal logic asserts itself with brutal clarity. You do not need a graduate seminar in ethics to understand the calculus. You are stronger. They cannot stop you. They have gold. You are hungry. In a brutal metaphor, this is the moment when a species discovers that cows cannot fight back. Not as cows. And so, you eat. You eat with a quiet conscience because a cow is not a moral equal. It is a resource. This is the underlying grammar of colonization. Once the strong can treat the weak as tools, meals, or collateral, they will, unless something stronger than appetite restrains them. Europe acquires the ability to project force across oceans, and the arrogance to call this theft civilizing. What makes this period different from earlier empires is that it is backed by an engine of accelerating knowledge. Better ships next decade than this one. Better guns. Better maps. Eventually, better statistics, better administration, better extraction. Power becomes self-reinforcing. And yet, in the background, something else is happening. Something power does not fully understand. The cow is watching. 5. When the cow starts walking upright. One of the deep facts of our species is that knowledge leaks. You can conquer, censor, ban books, erect borders. But if you demonstrate a way of doing something, sailing, smelting, vaccinating, creating industry, other humans will notice. The very act of domination educates the dominated. Japan watches the gunboats and spends the Meiji era rebuilding itself into a modern state. India produces lawyers and intellectuals trained in British law, who then turn that language against their masters. Egypt, Iran, the Ottoman Empire experiment with constitutions, parliaments, secular schools, railways, technical academies. The colonizer thinks in terms of raw material and markets. The colonized also sees institutions. This is the moment when the cow, under the whip, starts to evolve in front of the herdsman. Limbs changing, spine lengthening, jaw reshaping around words. The more it is beaten, the more it learns the master's language, weaponry, mathematics. At first, the colonizer is delighted. Look, they are modernizing. They will be better trading partners, more efficient administrators of their own subordination. Then comes the second realization. If they become fully like us, technologically, institutionally, scientifically, why would they stay on their knees? The animal part of power understands the stakes. If prey becomes peer, it might not only stop feeding the predator, it might decide that the predator is the cow. So something darker begins. Destabilization as strategy. Support the coup that removes the leader who nationalizes resources. Arm one faction against another. Play Islam against secular nationalism. Tribe against tribe. Ideology against ideology. Keep them just modern enough to be useful, never stable enough to be truly equal. This is not a coordinated conspiracy in the cartoon sense. It is a pattern that reappears across decades and continents. When the cow begins to stand upright, shock it, hobble it, spook it back into the four-legged posture. Out of this psychological terrain, the collision of aborted modernizations, humiliated elites, and repeated foreign interference, political Islam begins to take its current shape. Not as Islam the faith, but as Islam weaponized into a total political identity, claiming to restore dignity while sabotaging the very scientific and institutional path that could have achieved it. A bastard child of the colonizer's fear and the colonized's wounded pride. Part 3. The Two Sins. 6. The Sin of the West. Ingratitude and misdiagnosis. Civilizations rarely die from external enemies first. They die of bad self-diagnosis. The contemporary West senses that something is wrong. Debt piles up. Infrastructure decays. Politics becomes theater. Young people feel poorer, angrier, more precarious than their parents. But instead of asking the hard question, what exactly made us powerful in the first place, and what are we doing to those institutions now? The culture reaches for narcotics. Blame migrants. Blame queer people. Blame wokeness. Blame some vague loss of traditional values. This is the first sin, ingratitude. Not emotional ingratitude, but operational. A refusal to honor and protect the very structures that produced Western strength. Independent universities and research institutions. Scientific norms that privilege evidence over revelation. Legal systems that, at least in theory, can restrain the executive. A public sphere where argument matters more than identity performance. Instead, a rising politics does the opposite, starving public universities and turning them into debt factories or partisan battlegrounds. Undermining trust in scientific expertise whenever it conflicts with short-term economic or tribal interests. Resurrecting dogmatic religiosity as a political weapon, not as an inner discipline. Substituting conspiracy and myth for painstaking historical analysis. The right wing, especially in America, loves to talk about decadence, but its definition is safely misdirected. Decadence, in this story, is drag queens, gender studies, secularism, people having sex without shame. This is cowardice disguised as moral clarity. The real decadence is laziness and cowardice in the face of history. An inability to sit still long enough to study how Europe actually escaped its own dogmas. A refusal to accept that letting science and secular law loosen the chains of superstition was a gain, not a crime. A desperate need to experience moral superiority without doing the work of intellectual responsibility. It shows up in the fantasy that re-Christianizing the state, banning books, or silencing universities will somehow bring back the vigor of the age when those same institutions were learning to escape ecclesiastical control. It shows up in the nostalgia for strong men who openly despise expertise and surround themselves with flatterers and literalists. They promise to reverse decadence, but instead accelerate it by destroying the remaining autonomy of the institutions that guard truth. It is like watching a patient with liver failure insist that the problem is not the drinking, but the presence of sober people in the room. The sin of the West is not that it lost faith. The sin is that it lost gratitude for the painful, internally violent process by which it learned to let go of certain kinds of faith in public life, and is now racing to put the chains back on, while calling it salvation. 7. The sin of the Middle East, abandoned nerve, and weaponized God. If the West is guilty of ingratitude, the Middle East carries its own equally grave betrayal. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, across the Ottoman domains, Iran, Egypt, the early Arab states, there were genuine attempts to build a modern state using science, law, and industry. Modern schools and universities. Technical academies, early parliaments and constitutions, railways, telegraphs, legal reforms. They were imperfect. They were often elitist. But they were a direction toward the same institutional architecture that had powered Europe's rise, adapted to local realities. Then the combination hits. Colonial partition and mandates. Coups backed by foreign powers when nationalist leaders challenge resource arrangements. Cold War games played on local territory. Authoritarian secular regimes that crush dissent, lose legitimacy, and leave a spiritual vacuum. Into this vacuum steps political Islam, offering something intoxicating. A promise of dignity after humiliation. A story that explains everything in one stroke. The West is evil. The rulers are corrupt. God is on our side if we just purify. A totalizing identity that fuses faith, law, and state. It is easy and correct to note that Western powers often encouraged religious forces as a counterweight to secular nationalism. That is part of the story. The colonizer did kick the evolving cow. But the other part is internal. The region lost its nerve. Instead of insisting on finishing the transition to secular institutions, scientific autonomy, and pluralistic politics, all of which could have drawn on its own earlier golden age, it retreated into over-indexed religion, turning Islam from a faith and legal tradition into an all-consuming, brittle ideology, elevating clerical authority over scientific and institutional autonomy, allowing tribal, sectarian, and factional identities to masquerade as divine truth. The result is a relapse into tribal, instinct-driven, barbaric animality, but now armed with modern weapons and oil money, wrapped in sacred vocabulary. It is crucial here to separate Islam, the faith, from Islam, the weapon. Islam, historically, housed scholars, physicians, philosophers, poets. Political Islam, as it has emerged in many places, is what happens when a wounded society picks up God like a gun. The sin of the region is not being religious. The sin is abandoning the incomplete, fragile but real project of building truth-seeking institutions and letting God be conscripted into the service of anger and control. If the West's sin is ingratitude to its own miracle, the Middle East's sin is abandonment of a miracle that was within reach for the second time in its history. Between them, they create a feedback loop of fear and violence. The West keeps fucking the Middle East, to use a blunt but accurate metaphor, intervening, exploiting, destabilizing, because it fears a truly equal, modern rival. The Middle East keeps arming its wounded pride with God instead of microscopes and universities, insisting that the answer to humiliation is more purity. And under all of it, the same animal logic: eat or be eaten, rule or be ruled, rape or be raped. The spark is forgotten on both sides. Part 4. The Multipolar Future and the Choice. 8. Not collapse, but contraction. So what now? The mistake is to imagine an apocalypse where the West vanishes overnight and the barbarians pour through the gates in a single dramatic moment. The more likely future is contraction and redistribution, not cinematic collapse. The West will likely remain enormously wealthy and technologically advanced by any historical standard, lose its relative monopoly on scientific and military capacity, face internal polarization that makes coherent long-term projects harder. Other centers of power, China, India, regional blocs, will expand their share of global innovation, manufacturing, and military capability. The world will become multipolar, not post-Western. Science will not stop. It will decenter. The danger is not that the telescopes go dark. The danger is that the societies holding them lose the ability to use what they see without tearing themselves apart. Climate science ignored until thresholds are crossed. Biotechnology outpacing ethics and governance. Artificial intelligence amplifying propaganda and tribalism instead of understanding. In such a world, both Western and Middle Eastern societies face a common test. Can we remember what made our brief moments of greatness possible? And can we bear the pain of being corrected by reality again? The alternative is easy and familiar, each side doubling down on its preferred narcotic. The West drowning in culture wars, nostalgia, and performative religiosity. The Middle East deepening into dogmatism, sectarian conflict, and permanent grievance. Both paths end not in heroic collapse, but in mediocre, dangerous stagnation, powerful enough to hurt each other, too cowardly to grow. 9. Gratitude as strategy. Here is the heretical suggestion. Gratitude is not a sentiment. It is a strategy. For the West, gratitude would mean naming clearly that its power came from truth-seeking institutions, universities, labs, courts, parliaments, free presses, and the painful secularization that separated the state from total religious control. Defending those institutions even when they humiliate national myths, expose leaders, or contradict cherished dogmas. Accepting that the narrative of Christian civilization or Western values is dangerously incomplete without the ugly, bloody, courageous story of how Europe fought its own churches, princes, and traditions to free the telescope. For the Middle East, gratitude would mean remembering its own golden age, not as nostalgia, but as precedent. Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, as proof that Islam and science can coexist, that a Muslim civilization can lead in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Honoring the aborted secular and scientific reforms of the last 2 centuries as wounds to be healed, not betrayals to be reversed. Refusing to let God be used as a substitute for competence evidence, and institutional responsibility. Gratitude, in this sense, is the opposite of both victimhood and arrogance. It says, "We did not create this light alone. We are not entitled to keep it regardless of how we behave. We owe something to the dead who built these structures, and to the living who will inherit the wreckage if we let them rot." It is also, bluntly, the only thing that has ever worked. Civilizations that endure and adapt do so by periodically humbling themselves before reality, reforming institutions when they fail, funding long-term education and research even when the short-term ledger screams, allowing criticism even from those they despise, accepting that being proven wrong is a feature, not a bug, of staying alive. Call it secular repentance if you want, or call it the only known antidote to the animal in us. Epilogue: a prayer for the animal who learned to speak. Underneath the telescopes, the rockets, the scriptures, the constitutions, we are still animals. We still flinch at pain, hoard food, form packs, sniff out weakness. We still instinctively treat the vulnerable as prey and the unfamiliar as threat. The miracle of the last few centuries was not that one civilization became morally pure. It was that, for a brief moment, a small corner of the species built tools that could override the immediate whisper of the animal. Check the sky. It does not care about your pride. Run the experiment. Nature is not impressed by your slogans. Read the opposing argument. The truth is not owned by your tribe. Europe did that in one way. The early Islamic world did it in another. Other regions are doing it now. The tragedy is that both the West and the Middle East stand today at altars they no longer recognize. One smashing its own instruments in the name of a counterfeit moral revival. The other clutching God so tightly he can no longer breathe, terrified of the very doubt that once made it great. So here is a prayer, offered without illusions, for the animal who learned to speak. May we remember the rooftop and the moons that moved. May we remember Baghdad's scholars and the books that crossed languages and borders. May we remember that every time we chose evidence over comfort, we stepped out of the food chain for a moment and became something else. And may we find, in the middle of our fear of decline and our hunger for revenge, the one posture that has ever allowed civilizations to heal. Not domination, not innocence, not nostalgia, but a hard, unsentimental gratitude. For the fragile spark that made us powerful, for the hands that carried it before us, and for the unbearable truth that if we keep trying to eat each other, the spark will move on without us. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.